Hello, my name's Ruby Peacock, and I'm a volunteer with Amnesty, a member of the local Amnesty Ipswich group, and a law student. I've been writing an article on the impact of coronavirus on human rights in South Africa, and I would like to share the findings of some of that research with you during this talk. This talk would obviously ordinarily be face to face, but because of the current circumstances, we still wanted to be able to bring it to you online. So, this is the structure of the talk that I'm going to go through. Firstly, I'm going to outline some of the general circumstances in South Africa, then going to speak about the law generally and within the context of coronavirus. And then I'm going to outline 3 impact areas. So these are 3 areas that my particular research that I've done have highlighted a pronounced impact due to coronavirus. And those there are just on the screen for you to see. Then I'm going to close just by highlighting some of the particular difficulties that may arise as lockdown ceases and South Africa moves towards something closer to normality or pre-lockdown state. So just to begin with some of the circumstances in South Africa, although as a country South Africa is sparsely populated, for example in comparison to the UK, it does have some very densely populated areas which mostly occur in townships where inhabitants will share facilities and where people will often be living in very close quarters. There are some statistics on the screen just there about some of the population densities. Another thing another circumstance which could give rise to a threat due to coronavirus is that only 1 in 5 South Africans have access to medical aid coverage. And those are some of the circumstances in summary, therefore, which would mean that the South African government might wish to take a stronger approach to coronavirus because of fears of it spreading very quickly. However, there are some circumstances in South Africa which mean that the South African government may also have reasons to be hesitant about going into or staying in a state of lockdown because of the fragility of the economy. So very high unemployment rates, that was 27% in 2019. And then also, as I've mentioned, a fragile economy. So where there are times of uncertainty, such as a pandemic, investors in South Africa tend to take a wait and see approach, which can have a lasting negative impact on the economy. And then this is just to give you a bit of information about coronavirus in South Africa. It's been the worst hit country in sub-Saharan Africa in terms of cases and ranks second only to Egypt in terms of deaths. The stats again there on the PowerPoint there for you. Lockdown was entered in South Africa on the 27th of March, and it has been described as one of the most restrictive lockdown scenarios in the world. So, for example, South African citizens at first in level 5, because they have introduced levels, weren't able to leave the home even for exercise. And, for example, alcohol and cigarettes were banned. The president of South Africa has actually been praised by many for his quick action in relation to coronavirus. But as we'll get onto, there are also some concerns about the way that the lockdown has played out. One element of the reaction to coronavirus, which potentially can be praised, is having taken learnings from the HIV and AIDS crisis. There is a strong basis for seeing the very restrictive measures in South Africa as a result of important learning from the approach that was taken during the HIV and AIDS crisis. So at its peak, HIV and AIDS were killing up to 1,000 South Africans per day. And the scientist Salim Abdul Karim was on the team for the AIDS crisis and now actually leads the 45-person ministerial advisory committee, which fronts the South African government's response to the pandemic. So there is a strong personnel link there between the two approaches. And when you put that in the context of recent headlines in the UK, which reflect that scientists are now considering that the UK, having entered lockdown a week earlier, could have halved deaths, the decision in South Africa to enter lockdown at an early stage when relatively few deaths had taken place actually could be praised and could be seen as learning from the HIV crisis. And then there are, of course, the circumstances in relation to apartheid, which are always going to be relevant when looking at South Africa. So it does remain one of the most unequal countries in the world, and the lasting legacy of apartheid is an entrenched, racially biased system. So whenever there are concerns about the police and the military being used, there's a concern about there being racial biases in that use of force there. And there are also concerns about the arbitrary nature of any laws which might govern lockdown, disproportionately affecting Black South Africans and people of colour in South Africa. So now just to go through the law, which I had explained I would touch upon. Just very generally, South Africa has a recent constitution which came into effect after apartheid and the move to majority rule. It is considered to be one of the most progressive constitutions in the world. It was developed by consultations with very large proportions of the South African population. So it does provide a very high standard of rights for South African citizens. However, providing rights and being able to realise those rights are obviously two very different things. And poor Black South Africans in particular struggle to realise the rights which the Constitution affords them. And that's where human rights organisations, and in particular public interest litigation firms, which conduct strategic litigation in order to improve the realisation of these rights, so to set case authorities which enable South Africans to access these rights, that's where these come in and are particularly important. So the legal landscape in South Africa is rapidly changing and is in a state of constant flux. Then just to touch on the law specifically in relation to coronavirus, the government in South Africa has taken a similar approach to the UK in that it's issued regulations under existing legislation, which is the 2002 Disaster Management Act. And the name of those regulations in the preamble are on the screen there if you'd just like to have a glance over those. And as I have alluded to, the rules under these regulations in South Africa are much stricter than many other countries. So every person is confined to their place of residence and are only allowed to leave it unless they're performing an essential service, obtaining an essential good or service, collecting a social grant, pension, or seeking emergency or life-saving or chronic medical attention. So a very limited set of scenarios in which South African citizens were able to leave their home. And as I've also alluded to, the South African government has developed levels to describe different stages of lockdown, and these levels are associated with different regulations. So they were on level 5, they moved to level 4, and they're now at level 3. Each level has regulations, and those are published on the website, on the government website. The link's on the screen just there, and are supported by directions, notices and guidance. So this approach has been praised for a high level of transparency and clarity and quick and speedy organised action. And there's also a final point of praise which I would like to touch on, which the Centre for Human Rights at the University of Pretoria has highlighted. they've noted that at the point the government realised they needed regulations in order to control the pandemic, they had a choice. They could either declare a state of emergency or declare a state of disaster. Now, the first state of emergency is considered to be a more serious state and allows for the suspension of human rights. But the South African government actually took the choice to announce a state of disaster, which allows for a higher level of scrutiny of the regulations and that they can be checked against the rights in the South African constitution. So that is seen as an indicator that the South African government was seeking to have a level of clarity and accept a level of scrutiny to the regulations, which is obviously positive in terms of human rights. However, there have been some problems which have been highlighted. There have been numerous legal challenges by human rights organisations. One recent challenge in Pretoria was successful, and a High Court judge ruled that an overwhelming number of the regulations had little or no regard for how they impacted on constitutional rights and didn't have a direct relation to reducing the rate or spread of the infection, meaning essentially that they were arbitrary. And that comes from a requirement in South African law for legislation to abide by the principle of rationality, which is very similar to proportionality in the law of the European Court of Human Rights. But essentially, any law which is enacted has to have a direct relationship in the context of coronavirus to reducing the rate and spread of infection. They can't simply be the government arbitrarily restricting personal freedoms. And in this ruling, it was decided that a number of the regulations, such as short-sleeved shirts being banned from sale, but many did not meet this level of rationality that was required. And essentially, the government was given 14 days to overhaul the regulations, but they have since appealed this decision or taken steps to appeal it. And then a second issue which can be highlighted, which is more general and also perhaps more difficult to litigate on, is the fact that the regulations can be seen to be indirectly discriminatory to a large percentage of the South African population. So for many South African citizens, it simply hasn't been possible to act on the government's guidance and advice, particularly for residents of townships or people who are homeless. If you're told to stay home but you share toilet facilities and you don't have access to soap and face masks to follow the guidance, it's very difficult to do as you're being told, essentially. And that's a particularly problematic scenario because many of the workers who keep crucial industries like hospitals and shops running live in townships in these conditions where they are unable to meet the government guidance. So I'm now going to move on to discussing the impact areas, which I mentioned earlier, the first of which being brutality by the police and military. So to give a little bit of background, policing was historically used in South Africa to maintain white supremacy and white minority rule. Many historians have reflected that apartheid South Africa was a police state, and if you wanted to read a bit more about that, there's the link to a journal, or not the link, but the reference for a journal article on the slide just there. Now, the South African Police Service, or SAPS, was formed or reformed in 1994 after the transition to majority rule. And although at first there was a strong drive to demilitarise the police after apartheid, in response to rising crime rates, violence by police forces and the same military tactics that were used by the police force during apartheid returned. And just to give an idea about complaints about the police service, 42,000 complaints were made between 2012 and 2019, and these complaints include quite serious allegations of rape, killings and torture. Now to just give a little bit more information about the military, the SANDF, or the South African National Defence Force, are the armed forces of South Africa. There was the previous SADF, which was disbanded in 1994. However, in actual fact, all of the equipment, personnel of SADF were absorbed by SANDF. And the history of oppression and murder, which is associated with the apartheid military, can't be entirely disconnected, therefore, from the SANDF. And indeed, in SANDF's own short history since 1994, since the end of apartheid, it does have a record for violence against citizens, and in particular for gender-based violence. So that would explain, as a bit of background information, why there are concerns on the part of human rights organisations whenever the police or the military are deployed to police or deal with South African citizens. So on the 21st of April, President Ramaphosa authorised the deployment of 73,000 members of the SANDF to help enforce the lockdown alongside police. And 10 battalions were at that point deployed. Police have been enforcing lockdown and have opened over 200,000 cases for violations of regulations since the beginning of lockdown. And contraventions have included breaches of curfew, breaches of the ban on alcohol and cigarettes, and gathering illegally, among other contraventions. Police management equally received 38 complaints against SAPS members in the first week of lockdown. 26 of those reportedly took place on the first day of lockdown. So whilst police have been rapidly opening cases in relation to contraventions, there have been a high number of complaints which have been taking place as well against the police. So just to zero in on some more of those actual details, there have been some concerning uses of police and military power. The country's police watchdog is examining a number of incidents which have been reported and taken place since the beginning of lockdown. So 11 people have been killed or allegedly killed by authorities since the beginning of lockdown. And there have been a number of examples of police abusing people. And as we've been seeing more widely around the world, mobile phone footage has been an important part of the discovery of a lot of these incidents with police. So, for example, a man called Vumani Mbele was whipped by police, and this was filmed on a mobile telephone and put on the internet, and that was in the township of Alexandra in Johannesburg. And there have been numerous other cases of undercover police officers, so people who appear to be just regular citizens walking along the street, suddenly chasing people who appear to be potentially violating lockdown regulations and whipping people in the street. Members of SANDF have been filmed kicking and beating people, and there's of course been a strong public reaction to this treatment. There's also a concern on the part of human rights organisations that police stations are failing to adequately investigate these cases when they are reported to them and aren't opening new cases. There's also been examples of very harsh tactics being used to police the lockdown. So police have fired rubber bullets at queues of people shopping outside supermarkets. And again, that was captured on a mobile telephone near Johannesburg. And actually, that's not been something that the Minister of Police has criticised. It's been seen that these people are breaking lockdown regulations, and therefore being shot with rubber bullets is essentially an adequate and necessary response to that. The president actually, at the point of imposing lockdown, did specifically ask security services to respect the civil rights of South African citizens, but the heavy-handed approach which has followed has undermined the public's support for the measures which were brought in. Many people are feeling incredibly frustrated by this scenario and feel that it echoes the oppressive era of apartheid. And there has been one death in particular which has captured the media and public's attention and has received great outcry in response, and that's the death of Colin Scozer, who allegedly was killed by SANDF forces on the 10th of April. His partner described in an affidavit security forces coming into their home, reportedly because a half-open can of beer had been outside in their front garden at the time when alcohol was banned, and had dragged him out, had slammed him against a wall and beat him with a machine gun, and he was declared dead a few hours after this alleged assault. His family brought an urgent action in the High Court, and they were seeking court orders to bring an end to police and military brutality in relation to coronavirus. And in response to those or to that urgent action, the High Court made a declaration essentially stating that all South African citizens are entitled to basic human rights such as the right to life, the right not to be tortured or to be treated in an inhumane or cruel or degrading way, even during an emergency such as the current coronavirus emergency. So essentially there's a feeling that the case of Colin Scozer is a reflection of an already existing problem with inadequate investigations into any allegations of brutality by the police and military. And there's been a strong connection between the death of Colin Scozer and the death of George Floyd in the States. South Africans have taken to the streets to protest the treatment of poor black South African citizens at the hands of the authorities. And there has been a feeling that the protests in America strike a chord with South Africans, that they see the police brutality in America and they see it in South Africa, and there is a global response to this, which is essentially that it needs to end. So protests outside the High Court in Pretoria have seen banners bearing the names of both George Floyd and Colin Scozer. Now, in relation to the second impact area of housing and shelter, there have been a number of issues in South Africa during lockdown which have given human rights organisations the strong impression that lockdown is worsening an existing housing crisis in South Africa. So that's included shacks being demolished and their inhabitants essentially made homeless, and the shutting off of utilities because inhabitants have been unable to pay their bills or their rent. And shack dwellers and renters are particularly vulnerable to having their utilities shut off, so that again puts poor black South Africans at a higher risk of being affected by the lockdown. And evictions, unfortunately, have not just been, as one might imagine, at the hands of private landlords, but also the city of Cape Town, for example, has been evicting residents from illegal dwellings, even though the regulations have stated that there should be a moratorium on evictions during this stage of lockdown. So at the beginning of lockdown, evictions were declared illegal. There's a quote there from the Justice and Correctional Services Minister on the screen, which you may want to have a little read of. But essentially the city of Cape Town evicted a community of residents in Makaza, and the Legal Resources Centre, which is one of the human rights organisations I was discussing earlier, have said that the city's actions have exposed the residents who were evicted to a higher risk of contracting COVID-19. And there's a quote there again from the Legal Resources Centre. There's been a second instance, so in addition to the evictions at Makaza, at Hangberg and Hout Bay, that there's been a removal of structures quite recently, where residents were essentially left homeless after the city dismantled allegedly unoccupied structures, and this led to quite a tense standoff in that area between residents who were protesting the eviction and the city. And in another instance, asylum seekers were evicted from a church where they were sheltering in Cape Town, also during lockdown. Now, beyond evictions, there have also been some issues with shelters which were set up by various authorities in order to house and isolate homeless people during lockdown. And towards the end of April, the South African Human Rights Commission released a report into one particular shelter at Strandfontein. And that report analysed the conditions at the shelter and came to the conclusion that the site was in gross violation of national and international human rights standards and needed to be closed down immediately. However, instead of responding to the report and addressing the concerns in the way that may be expected, the City of Cape Town actually refused to allow human rights monitors to perform their statutory duties and monitor the site, and launched an application to essentially get an interdict to disallow them from accessing the site and reporting on the conditions there. So on Friday the 15th of May, the court ordered selected representatives from the commission, including monitors, had to be granted access to the shelter. So the city was not successful in receiving an interdict, but this does highlight a significant issue in this area, that the shelters which have been set up, and particularly this shelter at Strandfontein, do not appear to come up to human rights standards, and including national and international standards. And there's been a particular concerning nature of the application by the City of Cape Town, in that it named specific workers, monitors, and appeared to be a SLAP suit, so strategic litigation against public participation, so intentionally a piece of litigation to threaten human rights monitors and to stop that level of scrutiny over the standards at the shelters. So the South African Human Rights Commission has made some serious allegations about the conditions in the shelter, and it has now been closed. There are some statistics on the screen about the 461 persons who left the site where they've ended up. But in essence, this has highlighted a serious problem with the housing crisis, which has been exacerbated by coronavirus. Now, this is just to touch on the final impact area, which is violence against women. Violence against women, or gender-based violence, essentially was an existing problem in South Africa. It's estimated that half of South Africa's population of women have experienced some form of domestic violence. And since lockdown, as with many countries around the globe, domestic violence has been recorded as having a significant increase. So in the first week of lockdown, the police received 2,300 complaints in relation to gender-based violence. And at first there was a particular problem in that under the regulations there was an oversight in that women were not allowed to leave the home in order to report domestic violence. So this has now been amended, but it demonstrates one of the ways in which lockdown has been particularly detrimental for the women of South Africa. And to present another statistic on the increase in domestic violence, 120,000 victims called a government hotline for gender-based violence during the first 3 weeks of lockdown, which presented double the usual call volume rather. Apologies. So there is, and it's important to highlight, an intersection between the impact areas we've discussed already, so brutality by authorities and housing and shelter, and the impact upon women, so a level of intersectionality to be recognised there. Apologies, just my mouse playing up there. So women in South Africa have suffered abuse as a result of police powers and deployment of the SANDF. So just some examples which abound from lockdown. An elderly woman was raped and murdered by men who said that they were soldiers sanitising homes. This is a woman in a very rural area, and it demonstrates how poor people in South Africa living in rural areas and poor women are exposed to a higher rate of risk when authorities are deployed to that area. And then in another instance, a woman was recorded again on a mobile phone being assaulted by a member of the SANDF, which itself have now condemned that action, and there has been an investigation launched, but it demonstrates again that impact of deployment of authorities and the brutality of authorities having a disproportionate impact upon women. So they are at higher risk of being subjected to violence where SANDF are deployed. And then in relation to housing and shelter, in the action relating to the Strandfontein shelter, the Women's Legal Centre became involved because of a report of a woman being raped at the shelter, in that they were instructed to represent her. And the Women's Legal Centre have been engaging with the city regarding the safety of women at the shelter and at other shelters around the city, attempting to expose some of the situations that they're placed in and to protect women who may be at higher risk, particularly homeless women. So Charlene May, who's a attorney at the Women's Legal Centre, explained that no matter where in South Africa a woman finds herself, she is at risk of experiencing violence. But homeless women are a particular risk in a setting such as a shelter, where research has shown that she may be the victim of violence from the homeless men that she shares the shelter with, as well as the staff and enforcement officers. So it's for that reason, and in light of the city's silence in the face of requests for safety measures to be put in place, that independent monitoring is essential. So that was Charlene May's reflection on the situation at the Strandfontein shelter. Now, just to finally have a look at some of the circumstances and human rights abuses or human rights issues which may be pronounced as lockdown comes to an end and the South African government transitions South Africa out of lockdown, there are some particular concerns which arise, and there are 3 areas in which this impact may be felt. So schools, women's rights, and again evictions and housing. So just to look at schools, there have been some directions published by the government to handle the reopening of schools, and these were published on the 1st of June. These directions provide for a phased-in approach to essentially open schools up slowly and abiding by particular safety measures. But the amendments which were made to these directions also provide that schools may apply to deviate from this phased suggested approach by the government in respect of specific grades of their school, their entire school, or even particular dates which the government may have set. And human rights organisations have highlighted that this differential ability to apply allows for larger and well-resourced schools to operate at a fuller capacity, potentially at earlier dates, which will then exacerbate and polarise an already very unequal educational system where poorer, less researched schools do struggle. So the reflections on this are that there does need to be a system put in place to ensure that smaller, less resourced schools are not left behind. So perhaps this could be ensuring that they are forced to progress at the same rate, they aren't able to apply for these earlier dates, and also that potentially better resource schools have to support poorer schools in this phased approach of returning to full-time education. Now, just to touch upon the way that the transition out of lockdown has and may affect women, the president described the week following the movement from level 4 to level 3 as a dark and shameful week for violence against women. So there were a number of deaths which took place, including of a woman who was 8 months pregnant. She was found stabbed and hanging from a tree. Some really awful instances of violence which have been linked to the fact that between the shift from level 4 to level 3, there was a lifting of the restrictions on the sale of alcohol. So these were restrictions which originally were intended to slow the spread of coronavirus, but have had impacts on the safety for women as a result of alcohol suddenly being on sale again. So human rights organisations have commented that better protections should have been put in place for women earlier on, and there are concerns about further loosening of lockdown rules potentially having a differential impact on women, and calls for the government to take that into account when they are issuing directions and regulations in order to transition out of lockdown. Now, the third and final area in relation to the transition out of lockdown, which I will be touching on, is evictions. So as I've mentioned, there was an existing moratorium, or is an existing moratorium, on evictions during lockdown, essentially because activists highlighted that evicting tenants for non-payment of rent would be unconstitutional during lockdown and is also not a practical solution to the pandemic. So under levels 4 and 5, and also presently under level 3, evictions are illegal. However, under the current plans for the transition out of lockdown, it is said that evictions will be permitted under level 2. Human rights organisations have commented that this is essentially a disaster waiting to happen. There have been job losses and people unable to access income or lower rates of income during coronavirus, which could potentially lead to a slew of evictions as soon as evictions are permitted again. Landlords are still demanding payment of rent, often with little understanding for the circumstances which are leading tenants to be unable to pay, and there's a concern that a similar level of understanding or misunderstanding will continue into the next phases, whereby a large number of evictions essentially will occur as soon as they are permitted. So it's been noted that there does need to be structural and procedural protections in place to deal with this movement from a moratorium to evictions being permitted. And finally, I'd just like to offer a bit of a conclusion, in that South Africa poses a unique set of problems for its government in terms of responding to coronavirus in a fair and a transparent way. The government does clearly need to address the imbalances, the police brutality, the problems of housing, and the disproportionate impact of coronavirus on women, and in particular to offer control over the authorities, the municipal authorities and the police and military. Although coronavirus has clearly laid bare some of the stark inequalities in the South African system, there is hope arising out of this scenario, and that hope is that strategic litigation stemming from these issues raised by lockdown may have, if successful, lasting effects by improving realisation of rights for South African citizens. So just to offer a seed of hope. Thank you for listening to my talk. As with any normal talk in person, we would like to offer you the opportunity to ask any questions. But in this instance, if you could, on Facebook, comment any questions that you have, on Twitter, reply with any questions, or you're welcome to email me personally. My email address is on the screen there, and I'll be sure to reply to you however it is you ask your questions. But thank you for listening to my talk.